This is Dive In, podcast about diversity, equity, and inclusion in special education research. I'm your host, Federico Baitoler, Associate Professor at the University of Illinois at Chicago and board member of the Division of Research of the Council for Exceptional Children.
Welcome to our show. Today is our second episode of our second season. Today we have a very unique show about a unique topic. But before we get even started, I want you to remind you that you still have time to nominate some of your peers for the Division of Research awards. Particularly, I want to highlight two awards that are related to issues of equity and diversity and inclusion in special education. And those are the Distinguished Researcher from Underrepresented Groups Award and the Research Improving the Educational Access, Experiences, and Outcomes of BIPOC Students with Disabilities. So we have two awards. I'm sure you know someone who's doing amazing work and they will fit the profile of this award. So you have until November 1st to nominate your peers, and then they will receive the award. The selected ones will receive the award in our next CEC annual meeting in Baltimore in 2025 in March. So now back to our show. As I told you, we have a unique show today. The show today will focus on the experiences of Black students with autism. And for that, we interview Jamie Pearson, who is an associate professor at North Carolina State University. Jamie, Dr. Pearson, earned her PhD in special education at the University of Illinois in Urbana, and her work developing programs to increase activism and advocacy for Black parents of students with autism. We have a fabulous interview in where we talk to her about the inequities in regards to access to services for Black students with autism. We also talk about the experiences of those families in their communities. And also very important, I thought it was very interesting, you'll see we discuss some of the tensions that emerge on ABA programs, particularly when it comes to Black students. All right, so here's the interview. I hope you enjoy it and you learn a lot. Thank you, Jamie, for being here with us. It's a pleasure to have you with us and talking about this important topic.
Thanks so much for having me, Federico. I'm really glad to be here.
Yeah, we're glad that you're here. I think you're going to provide us great insights for our audience. I wanted to start with a broad question, right? Because of course, special education always been a lot of discussion about students with autism, but you focus specifically on Black families. So I want you to give us, the landscape of what are the major equity issues regarding services for Black students with autism.
Sure. So I've been doing this work for, 13 or 14 years now. And one of the things that we've learned over time is that Black autistic children and their families face a number of disparities when we think about access to services and early diagnoses. And so one of those critical sort of equity issues regarding this population is that oftentimes the time from caregiver sort of presentation of initial concern, right, where a parent is saying, I think I'm seeing something different here. I think I'm seeing some regression in skills. The time from that initial concern to the point at which Black autistic children are identified or diagnosed is often, 2 or 3 times longer in some cases than that for white children. And so that's one of the major issues we see in terms of those inequities. We also see that Black autistic children can sometimes be diagnosed with other disabilities first, like oppositional defiance disorder, other behavioral disorders. Sometimes they'll catch the, learning disabilities, but not necessarily capture the cultural nuance that is sometimes embedded in autistic characteristics. And then the third thing I'd say is that Black autistic children who have co-occurring intellectual disability are more likely to be diagnosed. So when we have Black autistic children without that co-occurring disability, co-occurring intellectual disability, they tend to be a little lost in that diagnostic process.
Wow, that's very interesting. I want to do a follow-up question to the second reason you said. Why do you think, I can have many hypotheses about this, but why do you think they're more likely to be identified with a behavioral disorders than autism. For that's the case for Black students.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a big part of that is practitioner bias, right? We all have implicit and explicit biases. And I think when Black autistic children are going in to see providers or seeking diagnoses, that there are biases that shape how providers view and interpret behaviors in children of color, right? And so more often than not, there's an association with behavioral disorders and Black children than autism. And so I think that and there have been a few studies that have pointed to that, right? So I think that's a major factor that contributes to that particular disparity.
Wow. And do you think that could be a contribution for what we usually know, the disproportionate representation of Black students in emotional behavioral disorders, in contrast to usually the underrepresentation in service with autism? Would that play on that dynamics?
Absolutely. I think that, that gets exactly at that point, right? That practitioners and providers are more often diagnosing students with EBD, for example, as you said. And sometimes there are those co-occurring diagnoses, right? But in many cases, the providers are missing the autism because of the biases that we hold around what does a child with a behavioral disorder, quote unquote, look like, right? For many people, we have this standard sort of historical image of a, blonde haired, blue eyed white boy who is autistic. And I always do this activity when I do presentations and have people do a Google image search. And it's gotten a little more diverse over time. But even for providers, there's that sort of image or expectation that autism is white and male, right? And when it's not that, there's this assumption that, oh, this can't be autism in this Black autistic girl, for example.
Wow, that's so fascinating. Um, and the other follow-up question is going to do this access to services, or access to timely diagnosis and services, that has anything to do with some geographical distribution of services and how Black communities sometimes live in residential and segregated residential areas due to a long history, structural racism of how cities have been developed.
Absolutely. So there are a number of like systemic factors that shape kind of that access to services, but geographical location is a big part of that. Like for example, I live here in North Carolina. We have three or four sort of larger, more metropolitan urban areas, but then we have a very widespread numbers, several counties and communities that are very rural. I grew up in one of those small rural areas. And so for Black families that live in those more rural communities, there are much longer wait lists. They often have to travel across several county lines. Sometimes, depending on where they are in a particular state, they might even drive across state lines to get access to services. And so I think there are definitely some limitations in terms of their ability to access services in those more rural spaces, geographical locations. But then, even in the more urban spaces where we have more access to services, the wait lists are so long, right? And so, unless you have the social capital to be able to sort of finesse your way up the wait list that some people might have, you could be on those wait lists for a year or so before you're able to get a diagnosis or get an initial evaluation for your child. And so, I think there are both pros and cons to being in both of those spaces, but we especially see those disparities for families who are in rural communities who are in some ways disconnected from many autism support.
Wow. You kind of answer this. No, you kind of answer these questions that I'm going to ask you now, but I think I'm gearing towards more about the experiences of Black families of children with autisms, and you focus on Black families with autism. So my one of the questions I have: how they're so different those experiences from, for example, white families of students with autism. So they have different experiences when they are in their communities, when they have experiences with the schools, etc.
Yeah. So I think one of the reasons that the experiences for Black families broadly, like supporting family members or loved ones with disabilities, part of that just sort of broad experience is connected to our history of segregated schooling in the United States. It's connected to our history of distrust with healthcare systems and providers, right? Like when you think about things like the Tuskegee syphilis study, right? That has created distrust in Black communities. And it's connected with a history of stigma around disability, right? And so for many Black families, having that combination of, well, I remember when I had an uncle or someone who was trapped in schooling, like there's some fear around what it means to be disabled or means to be autistic. And so I think that is a particular experience for Black families that is, it creates some cultural nuance, right, to that experience for them. Another example is that oftentimes Black families raising or supporting autistic children or loved ones don't see themselves when they go to a support group. They don't see themselves when they reach out and look for literature, when they're doing a Google search and trying to understand more about autism. There's not a lot of racial ethnic representation that reflects their own experiences. And so sometimes they think, well, oh, this autism isn't a Black, experience. It's not a disability that impacts the Black community, right? And so I think that definitely plays a role as well.
Wow, that's fascinating. You also have an article about their experiences, for example, in church, I think.
Yes. Yes.
One of the things that I love about this podcast, I get to read great work like yours and other people that we interview and learn new things. But can you speak a little bit about, I don't know, that article about their experiences in church, in their
Yeah.
communities?
Sure. So, the work we've been doing over the years with Black families supporting autistic youth, particularly here in North Carolina, right? I'm in the Bible Belt. And so we interact with many Black families who also identify as Christian. We have other families who are believers and are people of faith from other religious backgrounds, but primarily Christian families who have really had to reconcile their religious beliefs and their sort of understanding of disability and neurodiversity. And for some of them, families and parents in particular have made meaning of their child's disability based on their religious beliefs. For example, I've had a number of mothers, probably at least a half dozen Black mothers, who said, my child has has autism or has a disability because of a sin I committed in the past, right? And that they felt like that was them sort of paying for that sin, right? Other families view it as a gift, and that, like, their belief in God, they believe that God is entrusting them to support and care give and raise a child who might have more support needs than a child without autism, for example. And so families view it in different ways. And the third thing I would say about the church in particular is that for many Black communities, the Black church is a primary source of community-based support, right? Not only do they go to church for sort of like, prayer and revitalization and those things, but also it creates community for many of these people. And so we've seen some families who experience that in a positive light. They have inclusive children's church spaces. They feel welcome. It is a space of belonging. And then we've seen other families who don't go to church anymore because they didn't feel welcome, or even their faith leader said, if you can't manage your child's behaviors, you can't be here. So we've seen the spectrum of experiences in the Black church. But it's interesting, though, because even for families who feel like they've been shunned from their place of worship, there's still this like yearning to be there and to be connected and to find ways to stay connected with that space.
Wow. I mean, all these insights that you're sharing with us, it really make a case of thinking that these experiences are unique and that is significant to just focus our research on those particular experiences. Thank you, Jamie.
Right.
And this is related to this other question I'm going to ask you, because one of the things that I read in your work that you mentioned in some of your articles, the lack of attention, especially education research, to these intersections of autism and Blackness. What do you attribute to this limited attention?
Yeah. I mean, honestly, one of the things that I think has contributed to the lack of attention to the intersections of race and disability is the limited representation of researchers and scholars of color. I will say, in the time that I've been in the field, I've seen many more colleagues and scholars of color who are now in special education or disability studies or psychology in those fields, which is exciting and encouraging. But, when I first started this work, it was very limited. I found myself citing some of the same folks who've been doing this work. And so I do think that it requires some representation in the field to ensure that we're sort of reaching those populations that have been historically marginalized and historically overlooked. and face a number of disparities. So I think that plays a role in it in terms of having researchers in the field to engage in research among those populations. The other thing I would say is I worked on an article with Steinbrenner a couple years back and a number of other colleagues from Frank Porter Graham, where we looked at the experimental studies that included students, the rate at which studies were including the racial and ethnic background or demographics of their participants. And we found these were specific to autism studies that nearly 3/4 of those studies, of over 1,000 studies, didn't report the race or ethnicity. And then when they did, most of the participants were white, right? And so there's a great need to have more concerted and intentional effort to effectively recruit racially and ethnically diverse samples for our research.
Absolutely, that's an area that in our research needs much more attention, and your work just comes to address those limitations. Um, one of the projects you've been engaging in different research projects, you've been very well funded, but one of the ones that grabbed most my attention that interests me the most is the project Faces, that where you work with Black families to for them to become advocates and be able to receive and ask for the services that they need. Can you speak a little bit about that project?
Yeah, sure. Faces is I always call it my baby. I designed Faces as a doc student with my dissertation project. So it stands for Fostering Advocacy, Communication, Empowerment, and Support. And it's a caregiver advocacy program designed specifically for Black families. It was designed with Black families and Black autistic children in mind, with culturally responsive and really intentional, pieces and components of the intervention. And so it is delivered in person for 5 weeks. So families come together once a week for 5 weeks for about 3 to 4 hours per session. And we focus on different content, such as what does stigma look like in Black communities? How do we address that stigma, right? How do we build information around autism and disability broadly? How can families and caregivers build and create effective partnerships with children's providers, with their family members, healthcare providers or educators, right? And then how can they support their children themselves? How do they implement evidence-based practices that will support social communication or perhaps reduce interfering behavior? So we try to provide them with, like, I call it a toolbox, right? Of tools, tips, and skills that can not only help them become better advocates, but that can connect them to community-based services that helps to build a community of support for them, and ultimately impacts positively the outcomes and quality of life, both for the autistic child and for the family unit.
Wow, that sounds fascinating and so much needed. Can you pick one thing that you will share with the audience that was the thing that shocks you or strokes you the most that you learned from this project?
Absolutely. The biggest thing, and probably the thing I'd say I'm just most proud of, is a sense of community that each of our cohorts builds. So every time we run Faces, the families that participate in Faces, they come away from this and they have ongoing connections. They stay connected with each other. They have social groups, and with their children will have social groups together. They continue to rely on each other and support each other, even in the absence of the research team, right? And so that is one of the things that stands out to me most is that Faces builds a sense of community that is long lasting for many of our families.
Wow, what a great life-lasting impact that they have on the families. That's amazing. I want to take you a little bit out of your work and ask you more a broader question about the field and some of
Mhm.
the tensions that are going on with ABA particularly. There's been in the last years a pushback against ABA, arguing that the practice is punitive,
Mhm.
that is, trying to delete students' identity, that they're trying to change the students without different from who they are. So how do you respond to those critiques?
Sure. I mean, I think I would start by just recognizing that my own sort of introduction to the field was in sort of an ABA based home program, right? That was my initial introduction to the field of special education and disability studies. And so I fully recognize, how I have been involved in that work in the past. And to that point, I see and understand that for some families, is socially valid. It has particular meaning and utility and usefulness, right? Many families have reported that, ABA has changed their child's lives in terms of being able to communicate or in terms of reducing self-injurious behavior. And so, from my perspective, I think it is important to recognize that families see value in that and that families have the autonomy to kind of speak to what is most useful and helpful for them. However, I also fully recognize and respect the neurodiversity movement, and I value highlighting and again respecting the voices of autistic and neurodivergent folks who say, you know what, ABA has been punitive for me, or it has negatively impacted my life. And so I think we are able to hold space for both of those. I think it's a highly contentious topic, and folks feel like you have to choose one or the other. The other big thing for me is like it's important for people to understand that ABA includes a number of principles. Like ABA itself is not one evidence-based practice necessarily, right? There are principles of ABA that many of us use every day without thinking about, such as reinforcement, positive reinforcement, right? So when you break it down and sort of think about what behavioral principles can I use within this paradigm that are effective, there are ways to sort of separate those. So again, I think it's important to recognize that for some families, there's some social validity, and that for some disabled folks and neurodivergent folks who have experienced ABA, it has been extremely traumatizing and damaging. And I think we have to recognize both of those experiences.
Wow. And how do you think that lay out articulate the history of Black families, right?
Yeah. That's a great question. One of the things I've heard from Black families in particular is that for Black families, when we think especially about autism, still right now, we're still looking at about 4-to-1 boys to girls. And so for Black families and parents who are concerned about Black boys in particular having experiences with law enforcement and police, there's a lot of fear around, if my child is engaging in what behaviors that might seem unusual, how will that be perceived? What might their interactions be with the police? Will certain behaviors be perceived as illegal or aggressive, et cetera, right? And so some Black families have said ABA has been helpful because it has actually helped my child assimilate to a white supremacist culture, that we help them to assimilate to what should be expected of them, to the sort of majority expectation of what appropriate behaviors might look like, whatever those are, right? But so to that end, I think Black families have often argued like it is necessary. And they also recognize some of the trauma that maybe has been caused in some spaces, but that they feel like without ABA, they're not sure how to reduce extreme or self-injurious behavior, and or how to have their child be able to um, live and flourish successfully or happily in a space that uh, in many cases doesn't, where they don't feel appreciated and feel like um, their children may not be valued or heard.
Yeah, I mean, you're bringing some very interesting tensions and contradictions, I think, within the field. I mean, because it's not, I don't think just assimilation, it's most, sometimes maybe just give them some tools to be able to survive, period, right? We're talking
Yes.
about people getting shot. So
Yes.
it's like just tools to be able, unfortunately, to survive in a very violent white supremacist context.
Exactly. Absolutely.
Well, thank you for your explanation on that and bringing those tensions. I want to move to some to for you to share some of your wisdom and give some advice. So I want to start with the first question. This will be three questions. Can
Mhm.
you give three pieces of advice to a state or district official or principals to increase access to services for Black students with autism?
Sure. Thinking about this question, from the perspective of principals, for example, I think schools are doing um, as good as they can at partnering with families, but I see over and over again that there's often a disconnect between family partnerships at a school level with the teachers, with the educators, with the IEP teams. So I think, for principals, thinking about strategies, techniques that can support stronger family to school partnerships where they are able to create a space where families feel a sense of belonging and where they feel welcomed is a critical thing. Another piece for both, I guess, principals and district leaders is just working to recruit, again, more racially, ethnically diverse educators um, who both see but also reflect the diversity of the classrooms that we're teaching in. And I think that's a critical need. And I will say, not just recruiting them, but retaining them, because we know in our field that it is hard to retain special educators. And so some of that is much more systemic, right, than we necessarily have control over when it comes to funding and how little we pay teachers. So I fully recognize those are some additional systemic issues. But I think for principals to be able to recruit and think about effective strategies for retaining those teachers is critical. And then at the state level, one piece of advice I have is that we think about not only funding structures, but other mechanisms to better support access to early intervention. Our early interventionists are often overbooked and overwhelmed, and many families, struggle, particularly when we have Black autistic children. If they're lucky enough to be identified while they're still in the early intervention window, there can be some tensions around the cultural responsivity of early interventionists who are coming into the home. And so I think from that perspective, we need more training around culturally responsive early intervention practices, but we also just need more funding to better support families who are receiving early intervention services.
Wow, those are great pieces of advice, and I want to stop and say that regarding what you said about recruiting and sustaining teachers of color or represents, our last episode was with Elizabeth Bettini talking about exactly that, how to recruit, retain, and how to diversify the special education workforce. So if you're in our audience and want to know more about that, just listen to our prior episode with Elizabeth Bettini. Um, Another question I have for you is for researchers. So we talked about principals and school officials. The second one is about researchers. What three pieces of advice do you have for special education scholars who wants to research equity issues in special education?
Mm, yeah, I like this question a lot because this is near and dear to my heart. I really appreciate and value the research that I get to do, but I also am excited that I get to recruit racially, ethnically diverse scholars, gender diverse scholars, neurodiverse scholars. And I think that requires a commitment from folks in the field to collaborate with Black autistic and or neurodivergent scholars and scholars from other marginalized communities and identities. Right, we have to have a commitment to collaborating with researchers who reflect the needs and the experiences of the populations that we're engaging with in our research. And so having a research team that is diverse in that way, I think it creates a space, again, where families want to engage or participate in your research, where they see themselves in the work that you're doing and understand that. I think the other thing I would say is engaging in research with and not on communities that have been historically marginalized. I think a lot of times families feel that they have, that folks are like constantly reaching out for them to participate in research and they don't necessarily feel like they're a partner in that, right? And so I think it's really important that we engage with families or with marginalized communities, with autistic folks and Black autistic folks in particular, so that their voices are amplified and represented in the work that we do.
Thank you, Jamie. So just to recap, it's just like bring very heterogeneous research teams where they represent multiple voices, where families can, if they're participating, families can see it reflected and have more comfort with working with people from underrepresented groups, and also do research rather on communities. Those are great pieces of advice. And my last question is, if you have to dream, what would you like to see in the next 5 years regarding equity and inclusion in special education research?
That's a good question. I think my answers are probably, I've kind of hinted at some of them throughout our conversation so far, but I would say If I could dream, I'd like to see more representation in our special education teachers in the field in terms of racial, ethnic diversity, gender diversity, and neurodiversity, right? I think it's empowering for neurodivergent and or disabled students to see neurodivergent and or disabled teachers in the classroom. Similarly, we need more representation in special education faculty and researchers. Folks who are doing this work in this space need to be more racially, ethnically, gender, and neurodiverse. And then I would love it if I was trained in special education. I come from a medical model of disability and fully recognize that is kind of the root of my training. But I would love to see our field move away from this deficit orientation around disability and really, grow to understand and appreciate the literal neurodiversity, of our population. And I think understanding that and then modeling that for others will, I think, help to sort of reduce some of the stigma that we see around disability. And I think that's a big piece. And then finally, going back to what I mentioned earlier, was just more representative samples in our research, ensuring that we are intentional about having more representation in our research studies.
Thank you, Jamie. Those are great pieces of advice that I think our audience can think and incorporate in their own work. Well, I want to thank you so much for being here with us. This was a fantastic and rich conversation, and I wish you best.
Thank you so much. I'm so glad I could be here, and I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Dive In, a podcast about equity, diversity, and inclusion in special education research. This episode was produced by me, Federico Vaitoller, with contributions of Dacia Gonzalez, Kelly Carrero, and Haya Abdelatif. I hope you enjoyed the episode and learned as much as I did. Take care, and I see you next time.